6 new members will be joining the group of emerging economies known as Brics, which stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now, while this expansion has been described as a new starting point for Brics cooperation, more than 40 countries had expressed interest in joining Brics, and 23 formally applied to join the club. The group already represented a quarter of the global economy and 40% of the world's population. The group of emerging economies has been in formal existence for 15 years. But many experts say has not achieved much, and the diffuse nature of their political and social interests means Brics leaders do not always agree on the issues. Now, the expansion of the group is part of its plan to build dominance and reshape global governance into a multipolar world that puts voices of the global south at the center of the world agenda. Joining me now is Irina Muresin. She's Senior Researcher, Institute for Global Dialogue. Irina, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
So this is the 15th Brics Summit, and we know that the group has struggled to be that counterweight to Western powers that it has really hoped to become. And not much has been done by way of reforming global economic governance or even global governance generally. So what do you think Brics can really point to as any success in the past 15 years?
It's interesting. And as you say, the Brics had started saying that their voices are not heard across these global economic platforms like the IMF, the World Bank. And fine, Brics countries represent just over 40% of the global population, and they only had over 10% of the voting rights at, for example, a WTO forum. But when you look at what Brics stands for collectively, it's really about the domestic capacity to navigate the geopolitics at the same time. So can Brics have some kind of success in the last 15 years? We are seeing quite a bit of a shift to a post-Western world where change is gradual, more gradual than some would appreciate. And there is still immense interest in the Brics project. There is growth in some sectors only, and with the increase of multipolarity as well. Again, much of the challenge does lie on what they can and can't agree on, but for the time being, the Brics really try to focus on what they can agree on.
Okay, and so finally they agreed to expand and take on new members. And as part of the first phase, Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates will join Saudi Arabia and Iran to become full Brics members in January 2024. It's expected that other phases will follow because, as I said earlier, more than 40 countries had expressed interest in joining and 23 had formally applied to join the club. But when we look at this expansion with this 6 members joining, Saudi Arabia is saying they still have to review a few things, but most likely will also join by 2024. What do you think this expansion does in particular for Brics and for the countries who are members of Brics?
So many have said that the current members and the politics they have, the ideology they have, actually dilutes the power of the Brics politically because it's difficult to reach consensus. When you come to the phase 1, phase 2, there is an apprehension for analysts to say, well, what is this kind of expansion really going to achieve? Is it going to become too big too quickly? Because when you consider the modalities of the practical engagement, it is a political grouping, of course, but they have an interministerial level of engagement politically on aligning, streamlining policy where they can in terms of cooperation. Then you have institutionalized platforms where you find government traction, like your New Development Bank, think tanks, business, fine. And then finally, you get to dialogue fora like civil society. And so these need to be integrated, or countries need to integrate themselves in this. Pardon me. And so it's interesting because you have on the one side, phase 1, new countries being admitted. Previously, last year, a number of countries were also admitted to the New Development Bank. And it's still, for me, a teething period to see what does expansion bring. Is it the geo-economic impetus, or is it going to focus on countervailing geopolitics in certain regions?
And that's really going to be quite interesting because with this expansion now, we see that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, and Egypt, that marks the first Middle East and North Africa representation. Then, of course, the inclusion of Argentina was championed by Brazil, bringing in another South American economy as well. And some say, as you've mentioned, of course, that they already have these diffuse issues and interests that have made it quite difficult. Having these new members on board may just make it more difficult. But then again, maybe not. But let's move on to something else, because one of the key outcomes of the summit was the announcement of a comprehensive trade agreement among Brics nations. As much as the countries have the potential to drive this initiative, Irina, let me ask you, what is likely to be the trade design, and how will that improve investments, economic cooperation, and even revenue for the Brics member nations? What are we looking at here?
So this kind of trade agreement is based on previous trade agreements. What has happened in previous summits, or the previous strategy that Russia's chairship actually came out with, was to look at economic trends and condition with trade as significant proponents to navigating geopolitics, geoeconomic challenges, including this intra-Brics cooperation. So the strategy outlines the importance of including and creating relationships between micro, small, medium-sized enterprises, the burgeoning role of macro trade environments, as well as supporting established institutions and higher levels of Brics integration, including areas of investment and finance. But what is new, specifically with the summit, is galvanizing ministries and new members to find alternative payment systems and using local currencies.
And that's a major one, and one that we see is also being pushed by Russia. So let's go to that elephant in the room. Notably physically absent, but present virtually, was Russia's President Vladimir Putin. And we know it was Russia and China that seem to have been the main drivers of the expansion of the group. Now, Putin told the bloc summit that members would discuss switching trade away from the dollar and into national currencies, I beg your pardon, and that the Brics New Development Bank would play a key role in, I quote, the objective, irreversible process of de-dollarization of our economic ties is gaining momentum, end of the quote. Now, this has been an issue that has gained backing in the past several years, especially as we saw the strength of the dollar against other currencies in the past 2 years or so. This idea of de-dollarization, what do you think, or how far do you think Brics can get with it? It seems to be a much more personal issue for Russia and President Putin than it may be for many others. Again, given the current situation of the Ukraine-Russia war as it may be, but what can Brics achieve with chasing this de-dollarization dream? Some might call it a pipeline dream. What do you think?
I think de-dollarization can have several degrees, from lessening its use to complete moves away from it. So I think in the geo-economic environment where the dollar has been weaponized, we've seen the US use unilateral sanctions to weaken countries. And this is where Russia is coming from. And what's important is to note that the de-dollarization debate is about reducing risk. But at the same time, in the immediate sense, it comes down to businesses. The dollar has been used extensively over decades. And so when you use the dollar, there is liquidity, security, reusability. And traders want to make sure they receive the value they bargained for. And the goods they pay for are still there. So there is a lot of trust associated with the dollar. But what does this mean? This means that the Brics need to work on creating a solid network of trust in currencies and local currencies and the payment systems that they want to use.
All right, my final question, Irina, before I let you go. President Cyril Ramaphosa, he said that the changes that have taken place in Brics economies over the past decade have done much to transform the shape of the global economy. But we're also seeing a new wave of Western protectionism and unilateral measures that are coming into play. So what challenges do you think lay ahead of Brics? This battle to upset global dynamics that have been entrenched, like the example about the dollar, is not going to be an easy one. And there are those who wonder if Brics can become more than an acronym and really become the champion of the global South, which accounts for 85% of the world's population. So what do you see ahead of the Brics grouping, especially now with 6 new members and many others waiting in the wings? What challenges do we expect them to face?
By some, it's still seen as a champion of these kinds of interest, the global South particularly. And when you look at the West and how it's been incredibly privileged to lead in setting values and principles that others feel compromise their being able to implement their own interests or engage their own interests, the world is changing. And we are, again, in a post-Western world. But this is something very hard for the traditional West to really accept. The challenges for the Brics, I believe they are trying to circumvent the challenges they are going to start seeing. especially with the new members coming up, one of the ideas is that look at the theater of play of geopolitics, where there is currently a lot of interest, specifically, in Ukraine and Russia, but then also the Middle East, and then also upcoming, there's an anticipation of the Indo-Pacific playing a very big role. Now, is the challenge to circumvent these hotspots by drawing attention away from it into a Middle East, North Africa policy, strategically speaking? We're still to see this, but this kind of engagement looks to expand markets in the Middle East specifically, but also looks to solidify this kind of engagement where traditionally Western powers have played a greater role. It's still an exciting time and incredibly interesting to see what's going to be happening.
And I think that's the perfect place to end the conversation. Exciting time, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Many of us do want to see that counterbalance because of the overarching influence, we might put it, of the West, and of course the dollarization issue and how that has really been a tough place for many African currencies in the past year or two. And I think with COVID and of course the Russia-Ukraine crisis, it has really shined a spotlight on some of the fissures with global trade and the need for even Africa itself to make sure it moves very quickly with the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, make sure that intercontinental trade is strong so that we are not as susceptible and vulnerable as we've been with these two major life-changing, decade-defining situations that literally happen back to back, as it might be. Irina, thank you so much for joining me. I know we'll be having you again. As we said, this is all developing. We look forward to seeing more countries join on board and how the global economy and the dynamics around it are also shifting and changing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been fantastic.
All right. And that's as much as we can take on this Friday edition of Business Edge. If you've missed any of our compelling conversations and interviews this week focused on the African economy, business, trade, and finance, you know what to do. You can head to our website. That's www.newscentral.africa. You can go to our social media timeline at News Central TV, and of course, head to our YouTube channel and all the platforms where available and catch up on what you may have missed in this past week. At 12 p.m. West African time, you have News Central Now with all the latest from here on the continent and beyond coming your way. I'm Tolulokwe Adeleru Balogun. After a profitable week, I wish you a very restful weekend. We'll see you 11 a.m. West African time on Monday.